She made it to the gate with barely 2 minutes to spare, still wearing her hospital scrubs and the identification badge clipped to her chest. The badge swung lightly as she walked, a reminder of the shift that had started long before sunrise and refused to end on schedule. Emma Carter had been called into the hospital at 4 o'clock that morning. A severe trauma case had arrived unexpectedly. A construction worker suffering from massive internal bleeding. It was the kind of emergency that consumed entire teams for hours and left no room for checking the time. Emma had stayed until the patient was stable because leaving earlier had never felt like an option. That was simply who she was. Her original plan had been simple. Finish her shift, go home, change clothes, and head to the airport. Instead, she had rushed home only long enough to grab the suitcase she had packed the night before. There hadn't been time for anything else, not even changing out of her scrubs. By the time she reached the airport, exhaustion was pressing against every muscle in her body. The gate agent glanced at her uniform, then at her boarding pass, then back at her uniform again. The look lasted only a second. "Have a good flight, ma'am," the agent said. Emma nodded and continued down the jet bridge. The boarding pass said C2A, first class. The aircraft cabin carried the familiar quiet of an early morning flight. Most passengers looked half awake, moving through routines they had repeated 100 times before. Soft conversations drifted between rows, while flight attendants prepared for departure. Emma placed her bag in the overhead compartment and slid into the window seat. She exhaled slowly as she settled in, grateful for a moment of stillness. Outside the window, baggage crews moved across the tarmac beneath a pale gray sky. For the first time all morning, she wasn't rushing. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. The silence lasted less than 30 seconds. "Excuse me, sweetheart." Emma opened her eyes and turned toward the voice. Across the aisle sat a man in his mid-50s, wearing an expensive tailored suit. A polished Rolex gleamed beneath the cuff of his shirt. Beside him sat his wife, equally immaculate in designer clothing and jewelry that probably cost more than most people's cars. Both were staring directly at her scrubs. The man smiled, though there was something unpleasant beneath it. "I'm just curious," he said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "How exactly does a nurse afford a first-class seat?" A few people looked up from their phones. His wife laughed. Then another passenger chuckled. Emma remained silent. Years of working in emergency rooms had taught her that not every comment deserved a response. Without a word, she stood and reached up to adjust her bag in the overhead bin. As she stretched, the fabric of her scrub top shifted slightly. For only a moment, a tattoo became visible on her right shoulder blade. An anchor. At its center were the Roman numerals XX. 3 rows behind her, a man wearing a dark jacket froze. He slowly lowered the drink in his hand. His expression changed instantly. It wasn't anger. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. The kind that stops a person cold and makes the entire world suddenly seem much smaller than it was a moment before. It was the first real stillness Emma Carter had experienced all day. After a trauma shift that had begun before dawn, after hours spent fighting to keep a construction worker alive, after racing home only long enough to grab a suitcase and rush to the airport, she had finally found a moment where no one needed anything from her. She settled into seat 2A and leaned back against the soft leather. Outside the window, the airport moved with its usual rhythm. Ground crews guided baggage carts across the tarmac. Fuel trucks crawled between aircraft. The sky remained wrapped in the pale gray light of early morning. Emma closed her eyes. For a few precious seconds, there was nothing to do. No alarms, no pagers, no trauma calls, no decisions that could determine whether someone lived or died. Just silence. The silence lasted about 30 seconds. "Excuse me, sweetheart." The voice came from across the aisle. Emma opened her eyes. The speaker was a man in his mid-50s, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. A polished Rolex rested beneath the cuff of his shirt. Everything about him suggested wealth, success, and the absolute certainty that both would continue indefinitely. His name was Richard Voss. He carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had spent decades hearing people agree with him. The kind of confidence that develops when promotions, contracts, and boardrooms consistently reinforce the belief that your opinion matters more than everyone else's. He was traveling to a corporate board meeting he had spent months preparing for. His posture suggested that the entire aircraft existed merely as transportation for someone important. Beside him sat his wife, Diana. Her designer jacket probably cost more than Emma's monthly rent. Her hair was immaculate. Her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. She had mastered the art of appearing effortlessly perfect. The two of them had noticed Emma the moment she stepped into first class. The scrubs, the hospital badge, the tired face, the carry-on bag that looked hastily packed. Richard leaned toward his wife and whispered something. The words were too quiet for nearby passengers to hear. The smile accompanying them was not. Diana laughed. It wasn't a laugh caused by humor. It was the kind of laugh people produce when they want others to know they're sharing a joke. A woman sitting 2 rows back glanced up from her phone. A businessman nearby smiled briefly before looking away. The atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. The small, casual cruelty that sometimes appears when people mistake wealth for superiority had found its target. Emma heard every word. She turned from the window and looked directly at Richard Voss. Her gaze remained on him for exactly 1 second. No anger, no embarrassment, no irritation, just calm. The kind of calm that comes from having stood in emergency rooms while families received terrible news. The kind of calm that develops when you've watched life change forever in a matter of seconds. Compared to those moments, a rude stranger on an airplane barely registered. Emma said nothing. She simply turned back toward the window. That silence should have ended the conversation. For most people, it would have. For Richard Voss, silence felt like permission. He straightened slightly in his seat and glanced around the cabin. Years of presentations and executive meetings had taught him exactly how loud to speak when he wanted an audience. "Just curious," he said with a smile. "How does a nurse afford first class?" Several nearby passengers heard him immediately. Diana laughed again. A few others exchanged awkward looks. The woman with the phone shifted uncomfortably. The businessman behind Richard suddenly became very interested in his screen. Nobody said anything. Nobody intervened. Emma remained completely still. Then she reached upward to adjust her carry-on bag in the overhead compartment. The motion was ordinary, forgettable, the sort of movement that happens hundreds of times during every flight. As she stretched, the back of her scrub top shifted slightly. For one brief moment, the skin of her right shoulder blade became visible. A tattoo. Simple, dark, precise. An anchor. At its center were Roman numerals. XX20. The glimpse lasted less than a second. Then the fabric settled back into place. The tattoo disappeared. Most passengers never noticed it. One man did. 3 rows behind Emma sat a passenger wearing a dark civilian jacket. Until that moment, he had blended perfectly into the background. He possessed the peculiar stillness seen only in people who had spent years in environments where unnecessary movement attracted unwanted attention. He had been quietly drinking coffee and reading reports on a tablet. The moment he saw the tattoo, everything changed. His hand stopped moving. The coffee cup lowered slowly onto the tray table. His jaw tightened. Not dramatically, just enough. Then he stood, carefully, deliberately, and began walking toward the front of the cabin. The expression on his face was not anger. It was not surprise. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that reaches across years, memories, and buried history, and suddenly makes a stranger impossible to ignore. The expression on the man's face was not anger. It was not surprise. And it certainly was not the expression of someone preparing to ask permission for whatever he intended to do next. Colonel James Harker had occupied seat 5A since boarding. He wore a dark civilian jacket, a plain button-down shirt, and practical shoes that attracted no attention. There were no medals, no insignia, no visible indication that he had spent most of his adult life commanding one of the most classified Marine units in modern military history. That was intentional. The flight itself was an inconvenience. 3 weeks earlier, he had booked a ticket because a meeting at the Pentagon had finally become impossible to postpone. For 6 months, he had found reasons to delay it. Eventually, those reasons had run out. His aide had quietly upgraded the ticket to first class. Harker had noticed. He simply hadn't bothered changing it back. Some mornings, even small battles felt unnecessary. So he boarded, took a seat, accepted a bottle of water, and settled into the familiar task of existing in a civilian environment. It was a task he had never completely mastered. Men like Harker rarely did. The clothing was correct. The haircut was ordinary. Everything visible blended perfectly into the background. Yet there were things that training never removed. The way he sat, the way his hands rested, the way his eyes briefly mapped every exit, every passenger, every potential concern the moment he stepped aboard. Most people would never notice. Anyone with the right experience would recognize it immediately. Nobody in first class that morning possessed that experience. Nobody except the woman sitting in seat 2A. The strange part was that Emma Carter had never looked at him. She hadn't needed to. Professionals recognized professionals without introductions. Then he saw the tattoo. One brief glimpse. Fabric shifted. Morning light touched exposed skin. Dark lines appeared and vanished almost instantly. An anchor. Roman numerals. XX. The image lasted less than a second. For Harker, it was more than enough. 30 years of operational experience had trained him to make life and death assessments in less time than that. His mind identified the symbol immediately. He knew the design. He knew its meaning. And he knew exactly how few people in the world had earned the right to wear it. 8 months earlier, he had seen the same insignia attached to a classified after-action report. The report had remained on his desk for 11 days, longer than any document normally stayed there, because 11 names inside it had never left his thoughts. 11 operators, 11 funerals, 11 losses. The mission had become legend within circles that would never publicly acknowledge its existence, and only 2 people had returned alive. Harker's gaze settled on Emma again. Hospital scrubs. Hospital identification badge. Exhaustion visible beneath calm eyes. To everyone else on the aircraft, she looked like a tired nurse traveling after a long shift. To Harker, she was something entirely different. Echo Phantom. The only female operator ever to complete the unit selection pipeline and deploy through 20 operational missions across some of the most dangerous environments of the past 2 decades. The mathematics were simple. The implications were not. He slowly set his drink on the tray table. Then he stood. Several passengers glanced up before quickly looking away. Something about his presence encouraged that reaction. He moved forward through the cabin without hurry, without hesitation, without wasting a single motion. At the front, Richard Voss was still talking. The businessman appeared completely unaware that his audience had changed. He was making another remark to Diana about airline upgrades, declining standards, and how difficult it apparently had become to distinguish first class from everywhere else. Diana rewarded the comment with another laugh. A couple seated nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. In the galley, Patrick, the flight attendant, was conducting the silent calculation every experienced crew member eventually learns. Intervene or avoid creating a larger problem. Most of the time, consequences made the decision. Most of the time, people stayed quiet. Emma remained seated by the window. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. Her expression had not changed since the first insult. It was the composure of someone who had experienced situations where mistakes cost lives rather than comfort. Compared to those memories, this cabin drama barely registered. Harker reached row 2. Then he stopped. For a moment, he ignored Richard Voss completely. Instead, he looked directly at Emma. The silence stretched. Not awkward, not uncertain, simply deliberate. The quiet confidence of a man who had never once needed volume, speed, or aggression to establish his presence in a room. And when Emma finally looked up, recognition flashed briefly in her eyes. Then he spoke. One word, barely above a whisper. Quiet enough that no one else in the cabin could hear it clearly. Echo Phantom. The effect on Emma was immediate and almost impossible to detect. Nothing changed on her face. Her posture remained perfectly still. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. Yet something shifted behind her eyes. It was the subtle change that occurs when a hidden door opens somewhere deep inside a familiar building. Nothing visible moves, but suddenly you realize the structure extends far beyond what anyone else can see. Emma slowly turned her head toward him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Colonel James Harker held her gaze with the calm certainty of a man confirming a fact he already knew. No questions, no introductions, no doubt, just recognition. Emma met his eyes and understood immediately. He knew exactly who she was. Not the exhausted nurse sitting in seat 2A. Not the woman wearing hospital scrubs after an overnight trauma shift. The other version. The one almost nobody knew existed. The silence lasted only a few seconds. Then Harker turned toward Richard Voss. If there is such a thing as justice arriving without warning, it often looks surprisingly ordinary at first. No dramatic speeches. No raised voices. No grand entrance. Just the sudden appearance of someone who understands exactly what is happening and has absolutely no intention of allowing it to continue. Harker stood in the aisle and looked at Voss. The expression on his face was almost relaxed. He had assessed threats far more dangerous than an arrogant businessman in a tailored suit. Compared to those experiences, this required very little effort. He spoke calmly. "I think you owe this woman an apology." The words were delivered so quietly that several nearby passengers instinctively leaned forward to hear them. It was the kind of voice that carried because it contained no anger, no insecurity, no need to prove anything, just certainty. Voss blinked. The interruption had clearly caught him off guard. He looked Harker up and down, searching for context, searching for rank, status, position, anything that would allow him to place this stranger into a hierarchy he understood. The attempt failed. There was something about Harker that didn't fit into familiar categories. Voss gave a short laugh. Unlike the earlier ones, this laugh lacked confidence. "And who exactly are you?" he asked. Harker didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and removed his phone. He held it casually in one hand. He didn't unlock it. He didn't wave it around. He simply looked at Voss and said, "Someone who can make one call and send this plane back to the gate." Silence followed. Not dramatic silence. Not shocked silence. The heavier kind. The kind that settles over a room when everyone suddenly realizes a conversation has become far more serious than it appeared a moment ago. At the front galley, Patrick flight attendants stopped mid-step. A woman 2 rows back lowered her phone. Several passengers exchanged uncertain glances. Beside Richard, Diana's hand tightened around his arm. For the first time that morning, she looked genuinely worried. Voss stared at the phone, then at Harker, then back at the phone again. His mind was racing. 3 months of preparation. A critical board meeting. Executives flying in from multiple cities. Schedules, contracts, negotiations, expectations. A delay would create consequences he had no desire to experience. Yet the calculation unfolding behind his eyes wasn't really about the meeting. It was about certainty. For the first time since boarding, he was no longer certain he understood the situation. His gaze drifted toward Emma. She remained seated by the window, quiet, composed, almost detached from the conflict unfolding around her. But now he looked at her differently. Not because he understood who she was. He didn't. He couldn't. There were experiences written into the way she carried herself that existed completely outside his world. Experiences measured in sacrifice, danger, and responsibility rather than titles and quarterly earnings. Voss looked back at Harker, and for the first time in years, perhaps decades, Richard Voss experienced a feeling that was both unfamiliar and deeply uncomfortable. The realization that he had run out of ground to stand on. He backed down less than 30 seconds later. Not because he was weak. Not because he lacked courage. Building a successful company from nothing required determination. Most people never develop. But this was different. This was the moment a man realizes he has mistaken confidence for authority, and suddenly discovers the difference. Richard Voss finally broke. Not because he was intimidated by volume. Not because anyone had threatened him. And certainly not because he lacked confidence. He broke because the man standing in the aisle possessed a particular kind of stillness. The kind that communicates something directly to the part of the human mind that operates beneath logic. The kind that says every word spoken so far has been completely true, and that testing those words would be a mistake. A very expensive mistake. Especially at 7 o'clock in the morning, before the most important meeting of the quarter. Voss looked at the phone in Harker's hand one final time, then at Harker's face, then at Emma. His jaw tightened. He cleared his throat. The gesture carried all the reluctance of a man preparing to do something his pride had not yet approved. "I apologize," he said. The words hung in the air, but he was looking at Harker when he spoke them, not Emma. Harker didn't move, didn't blink, didn't nod. He offered no indication whatsoever that the apology had been accepted. No relief, no escape, nothing. His expression remained unchanged. Calm, patient, waiting, not for an apology, for the correct apology. The distinction became obvious almost immediately. Voss understood. Slowly, he turned toward Emma. The entire first-class cabin was watching now. Every passenger, every flight attendant, every curious observer who recognized that they were witnessing one of those rare moments people would later describe to friends and co-workers. Patrick still stood near the galley curtain. The woman too rose back and set her phone face down on her tray table. The businessman behind Voss had closed his laptop entirely. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. For the first time all morning, Richard Voss no longer looked like the most important person in the room. "I apologize," he said again. This time he was looking directly at Emma. The words clearly cost him something. Not financially. Something far more valuable. Pride. The carefully maintained image of a man accustomed to winning every interaction he entered. For years, perhaps decades, he had allowed success to become part of his identity. Admitting fault publicly felt like removing a layer of armor. Beside him, Diana spoke as well. "I'm sorry." Her voice was quiet. Her eyes remained lowered toward her hands. Whether it was genuine embarrassment or simply the realization that the situation had changed dramatically, no one could say. Emma regarded them both for several seconds. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction, no desire to make the moment more painful than it already was. She simply looked at them with the calm patience of someone who had experienced hardships far greater than rude comments on an airplane. Someone who understood that carrying anger usually costs more than letting it go. Finally, she spoke. "I hope your meeting goes well, Mr. Voss." The cabin remained silent. Then she added, "Some things matter more than being on time." That was all. No lecture, no speech, no attempt to embarrass him further. Just a simple statement. Then she turned back toward the window. The conversation was over. The silence that followed felt almost physical. The kind of silence that settles into a space and refuses to leave immediately. Eventually, Voss lowered himself into his seat. He opened his laptop and stared at the screen with the careful concentration of someone attempting to return to normal after discovering normal is no longer available. Diana put on her headphones. The businessman behind them reopened his phone. Passengers shifted in their seats. The familiar rhythm of a first-class cabin slowly began rebuilding itself around the extraordinary interruption that had just occurred. Yet something remained unfinished. Everyone could feel it, because Colonel James Harker was still standing in the aisle. His phone remained in his hand, and his attention had already moved elsewhere, away from Richard Voss, away from the apology, away from the confrontation. His eyes rested on Emma. The expression there belonged to a completely different conversation, one with deeper roots, one that had nothing to do with airline seating, social status, or wounded egos. A conversation that had been waiting 8 months to happen. Neither of them had expected it to begin 30,000 feet above the ground. After a moment, Harker stepped forward. Without asking permission, without hesitation, he lowered himself into seat 2B, the empty seat beside Emma. And for the first time since boarding, Emma turned fully away from the window. Colonel James Harker settled into seat 2B without asking permission. The movement was so natural that it barely registered as a decision. He sat with the ease of a man who had spent an entire career making choices under pressure, accepting responsibility for them, and moving forward without looking back. Some habits become permanent. He placed his phone face down on his knee and studied Emma for a moment. Not obviously, not intrusively, just long enough to see the details that mattered. The exhaustion around her eyes, the loose strands of hair that had escaped sometime during an overnight hospital shift, the identification badge still clipped to her chest, and the bracelet, a simple black paracord bracelet wrapped around her left wrist. 11 small steel beads rested against her skin. Harker's gaze lingered there. He knew about the bracelet. 8 months earlier, he had encountered it in a footnote buried deep inside an after-action report. One sentence, 11 beads, one for each teammate lost. The detail had remained with him ever since. Reading about it had been difficult. Seeing it in person was something else entirely. Reality always carries a different weight than paper. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The aircraft cabin had gradually returned to normal around them, but the space between seats 2A and 2B existed somewhere separate from the rest of the flight. Finally, Harker broke the silence. Echo Phantom completed 27 missions. His voice remained low, measured, not conversational, almost ceremonial. 27 missions. No failures. Not one. Emma stared out the window. The clouds beyond the glass reflected the pale morning light. Harker continued. 15 years of classified operations in places most people in this country will never know existed. A pause followed, then another, longer this time. The final mission wasn't a failure either. His jaw tightened slightly. The objective was secured. Another pause. The intelligence was extracted. Silence. Then quietly. The cost is something I've been accounting for every day since. Emma listened without turning toward him. Her hands remained folded in her lap. The bracelet rested against her wrist. 11 steel beads. 11 names. 11 lives. They pressed gently against her skin the way they always did. A constant reminder. A permanent weight. The only form of presence she could still offer the people who were gone. Eventually she spoke. Not about the mission. Not at first. Instead, she told him about Danny Reyes, the veteran whose name had appeared unexpectedly in a hospital update. The plane ticket she had purchased without fully understanding why. The trip to Bethesda. The hospital room. The visit he never knew was coming. She offered only the essentials. The shape of the story rather than every detail. Harker listened carefully. Not politely. Not passively. He listened the way people listen when they're hearing something important. Something necessary. When she finished, silence returned. Then Harker reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. For the first time, Emma looked directly at him. He withdrew a photograph. Small. Worn. The corners had softened from months of being carried everywhere. Without speaking, he placed it gently on her tray table. Then he leaned back. No explanation. No introduction. No attempt to guide the moment. Some things deserved room to exist on their own. Emma lowered her eyes. The photograph showed 13 people standing together in desert gear. A place without a public name. A mission without a public record. A moment frozen before everything changed. She stared at it. One face. Then another. Then another. 11 faces belonging to people she could never call again. 2 faces belonging to survivors. One of them was hers. She looked younger. Harder somehow. Carrying a different kind of burden than the one she carried now. The photograph blurred slightly. She blinked, then looked up at Harker. For the first time since he sat down, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Not fear. Not anger. Something heavier. A question she had been carrying for 8 months. A question that had followed her through hospitals, sleepless nights, and every mile between then and now. "Did you know?" she asked quietly. Harker held her gaze. She continued. "Did you know we weren't all coming back?" The question settled between them. Harker didn't look away. When he answered, there was no attempt to soften the truth. No careful editing. No comforting version. Just honesty. Complete and unfiltered. He told her about the intelligence assessment. The projected extraction probability. 60%. 40%. Numbers that had looked acceptable inside operational planning rooms. Numbers that fit within established parameters for a mission of that classification level. Numbers that commanders were expected to accept. He told her he had reviewed those calculations countless times. Every day for 8 months. Every page. Every note. Every recommendation. Every footnote. And despite all of it, despite every justification and every strategic argument, the mathematics had never become easier to carry. Not once. Colonel James Harker had read every page of the report, every operational detail, every timeline, every intelligence assessment, every recommendation. But there was one page he always returned to. The page that described what happened after everything went wrong. The page that documented the moment when the mission stopped being a mission and became a choice. A single impossible choice. He had read the account of Emma's actions inside that collapsing operation more times than he could count. The extraction, the distance covered, the injuries, the conditions, the weight she carried. Not only physical weight, but responsibility. The burden of bringing someone home when almost everyone else would not be coming back. Each time he finished reading it, he found himself doing the same thing. Closing the file, leaning back, sitting silently for several minutes, doing absolutely nothing. Some stories demanded stillness afterward. Emma listened without interruption. Her hands remained folded in her lap. The black paracord bracelet rested against her wrist. 11 steel beads. 11 names. She possessed the quiet steadiness of someone who had spent years learning how to carry difficult truths without denying them and without allowing them to crush her. There was no resistance in her posture. No attempt to look away from the conversation. Only acceptance. The understanding that certain weights cannot be avoided. They can only be carried. When Harker finally finished speaking, silence settled between them again. Outside the window, the suburbs surrounding Washington stretched beneath a thin layer of cloud. Roads intersected in careful patterns. Neighborhoods spread across the landscape. Cars moved along highways. Thousands of ordinary lives continued below, completely unaware of the conversation taking place 30,000 feet above them. Emma looked down at the photograph resting on her tray table. 13 faces. 13 people frozen in a moment before everything changed. Her eyes moved slowly across the image. One, then another, then another. 11 gone. 2 remaining. The arithmetic never changed. After a long pause, she spoke. What she said next was something she had never told anyone. Not her supervisor at the hospital. Not her closest friends. Not even the therapist she had seen for several months after leaving the Marines. She had eventually stopped attending those appointments because explaining the loss always seemed to require more energy than the conversations gave back. The mission wasn't the hardest part, she said quietly. Harker remained silent, listening. The mission was what we trained for. Her eyes never left the photograph. My body knew what to do. My mind knew what to do. 11 years of experience was there when I needed it. Another pause. Then she continued. The hardest part was the morning after. For the first time, emotion touched her voice. Only slightly. Just enough. She told him about waking up in a military medical facility in Germany. About opening her eyes and seeing Danny Reyes alive 2 beds away. About the empty beds beyond him. 11 empty spaces. 11 absences. 11 places where people should have been. She remembered staring at those beds and understanding something for the first time. Not intellectually. Permanently. The number wasn't temporary. It wasn't waiting to change. Time wasn't going to fix it. No amount of effort would alter it. 11 was the number. And 11 would remain the number for the rest of her life. The only thing left, she said quietly, was deciding what to carry it as. Harker absorbed the words. Then he reached into his jacket pocket once more. This time he withdrew something smaller than the photograph. A folded document. Official Pentagon letterhead. Heavy cream-colored paper. He placed it gently on the tray table. Emma glanced at it but didn't unfold it. Harker explained anyway. Her classified service record was under formal review for official recognition. The process was moving slowly. Not because anyone opposed it. Because bureaucracy moved at the speed bureaucracy always moved. Classification reviews. Legal clearances. Interagency approvals. The complicated architecture required to publicly acknowledge operations that officially did not exist. But progress was happening. The 11 names represented by the beads on her wrist would be spoken aloud before the end of the year. Spoken in the proper room, before the proper people, placed permanently into the historical record. And the 2 surviving members of the unit would be present when it happened. Harker looked at the bracelet. They deserved to be remembered properly. Emma lowered her gaze to the 11 steel beads. For a long moment, she simply looked at them. Then she spoke. Softly. They already are. Harker waited. I make sure of it every day. The words settled heavily between them. After that, neither of them spoke much. Before descent began, Harker stood and returned to seat 5A. He slipped a photograph carefully back into his pocket. Then he paused beside her row. For a moment, he looked at Emma with the expression of a man who had boarded that aircraft carrying a burden. Not a lighter burden now, but one arranged differently, balanced differently, and sometimes that was enough. The burden had not become lighter. Some things never do, but it had shifted. The way weight shifts when it is finally shared with someone capable of carrying part of it, someone who understands its shape, its history, and its cost without needing explanations. Colonel James Harker stood beside seat 2A for a final moment before returning to his own row. There was one last thing he wanted to say, not because Emma needed reassurance, and not because he thought words could erase what had happened. Some things exist beyond repair. Still, certain truths deserve to be spoken aloud. What you did in that building, he said quietly. What you carried out of it. He paused. The aircraft hummed steadily around him. Very few people in the history of the program have ever been asked to do something like that. His eyes held hers. Even fewer have succeeded. There was no admiration in his tone, no attempt to flatter her. It wasn't praise. It was fact. The kind of fact delivered by someone who understood exactly what it meant. Emma nodded once. Nothing more. Nothing needed to be added. She turned back toward the window. Harker returned to seat 5A, and for the remainder of the flight, neither of them spoke again. The aircraft touched down in Washington shortly after noon. Emma collected her bag, exited the terminal, and took a cab directly to Bethesda Naval Hospital. She was still wearing her scrubs, still wearing her hospital badge, still carrying the exhaustion of an overnight shift, a cross-country flight, and a conversation she suspected would remain with her for the rest of her life. At some point somewhere over Virginia, she had stopped noticing what she was wearing. The scrubs were simply part of the day now. Another layer of a morning that refused to fit into ordinary categories. Inside the hospital, she approached the front desk. The receptionist glanced up. Can I help you? Staff Sergeant Daniel Reyes, Emma said. Room 414. The receptionist looked at the scrubs, looked at the badge, then nodded. 4th floor. No further questions. None were necessary. A nurse asking for a patient's room number in a military hospital rarely attracts attention. Emma thanked her and headed toward the elevators. A few minutes later, she stepped into a long corridor lined with identical doors. The familiar antiseptic scent of a hospital filled the air. No matter how modern a facility became, that smell never completely disappeared. Room numbers passed one by one. For 10, 411. For 12, Emma stopped. For a moment, she simply stood there. Her hand hovered near the door, not touching it, not knocking, just resting in the space before action. Everything from the day pressed against her thoughts. The flight, Richard Voss, the unexpected recognition, the photograph, the letter, the conversation with Harker. 8 months of grief and questions that had finally found somewhere to land. The moment felt strangely heavy and strangely peaceful at the same time. Finally, she knocked. A voice came from inside. Come in. Emma opened the door. Daniel Reyes was sitting upright in bed. He looked thinner than she remembered. His left arm rested in a brace. Scars traced new paths across his face. Not dramatic scars. The quieter kind. The ones that become part of a person until eventually nobody notices them except those who knew what came before. He looked toward the doorway. Then he saw her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was no awkwardness, no uncertainty, only recognition. The rare understanding shared by people who have survived the same impossible thing. Words would come later. First came the silence. Danny's gaze dropped to her wrist. The black paracord bracelet. The 11 steel beads. Then he looked down at his own wrist. An identical bracelet. The same 11 beads. Worn smooth by 8 months of daily contact. 8 months of remembrance. 8 months of carrying the same names. His eyes returned to hers. And then, for the first time, he smiled. A real smile. The first genuine smile Emma had seen on a familiar face since waking up in Germany and realizing what permanent truly meant. "I wondered when you'd show up," he said. Emma laughed softly. The sound surprised her. Then she crossed the room and sat beside his bed. For the next several hours they talked. About nothing important, and everything that mattered. Memories, stories, names, silences. The kinds of conversations that can only happen between people who already understand most of what remains unsaid. Outside the hospital window, the Washington afternoon settled slowly across the city. October sunlight turned golden. Shadows stretched longer. Life continued. Cars moved through intersections. People hurried between appointments. Entire worlds unfolded without ever knowing what was happening inside room 414. And that was perfectly fine. The city didn't need to know. What mattered was already present in that room. 2 survivors. 2 matching bracelets. 22 steel beads between them. 11 names carried twice. Remembered twice. Loved twice. And in that quiet hospital room, surrounded by ordinary walls and ordinary light, those 11 names remained exactly where they belonged. Not lost. Not forgotten. But carried forward every single day by the people who came home.